Good morning. So, as Alright, let's get started. Figure 31 shows the asset side of the Fed's balance sheet to help us see the effects of the large-scale asset purchases. The bottom layer is the traditional securities holdings. To be absolutely clear, even under normal circumstances, the Fed always owns a substantial amount of US Treasuries. We owned more than $800 billion worth of US Treasury, 800 before the crisis began. It is not as though we began buying them from scratch. We have always owned a significant amount of these securities, so the bottom layer shows the baseline from which we started. What else appeared on the Fed's balance sheet on the assets side during this period? The dark segment just above the traditional securities holdings represent assets acquired or loans made during the crisis period. You can see that in late 2008, our loans outstanding to financial institutions and to some other programs rose very sharply, but you can also see that as time passed, and certainly by early 2010, those initiatives to address financial strength had been greatly reduced. If you look at the far right, you see a little bump recently. That is the currency swaps. We instituted and extended swap agreements with the European Central Bank and other major central banks, and there has been some uses of that in an attempt to try to reduce strains in Europe. And that shows up as a little bump there at the far right of the graph, about 1 to 2012, I guess. Little bump there. Now again, we owned about $800 billion in treasury securities at the beginning of the crisis, but as you can see from the large area labeled LSATs, we added about $2 trillion in new securities to the balance sheet during the period starting in early 2009. And then at the top, we have other assets, a variety of things, security reserves, fiscal assets, and other miscellaneous items. Why were we buying these securities? This is, by the way, an approach that monetarists such as Milton Friedman and others have talked about. The basic idea is when you buy treasuries or government-sponsored enterprise securities and bring them onto the balance sheet, that reduces the available supply of those securities in the market. Investors want to hold those securities and they have to settle for a lower yield or put another way, if there is a smaller available supply of those securities in the market, investors are willing to pay a higher price for those securities, which is the inverse of the yield. So by purchasing treasury securities, bringing them onto our balance sheet, and reducing the available supply of those treasuries, we effectively lowered the interest rate of long-term treasuries and government-sponsored securities as well. Moreover, to the extent that investors no longer having available treasuries and government-sponsored enterprise securities to hold in their portfolios, to the extent that they are induced to move to other kinds of securities, such as corporate bonds, that also raises the prices and lowers the yield on those securities. And so the net effect of these actions was to lower yield across a range of securities, and as usual, lower interest rates have supportive, stimulative effects on the economy. Moreover, to the extent that investors no longer having available treasuries and GSE securities to hold in their portfolios, to the extent that they are induced to move to other kinds of securities, such as they are induced to move to other kinds of securities, such as corporate bonds, that also raises the prices and lowers the yield on those securities. And so the net effect of these actions was to lower yields across a range of securities. And as usual, lower interest rates have supportive, stimulative effects on the economy. So this was really a monetary policy by another name. Instead of focusing on the short-term rate, we were focusing on longer-term rates, but the basic logic of lowering rates to stimulate the economy is really the same. You might ask, the logic is really the same. They are induced. You might ask, the Fed is buying $2 trillion worth of securities. How do we pay for that? The answer is that we paid for, the Fed and Bank. We paid for those securities by crediting the bank accounts of the people who sold them to us, and those accounts at the banks showed up as reserves that the banks would hold with the Fed. So the Fed is a bank for the banks. Banks can hold deposits account with the Fed, essentially, and those are called reserve accounts. And so as the purchases of securities occurred, the way we paid for them was basically increasing the amount of reserves that banks had in their accounts with the Fed. Figure 32 shows the liability side of the Fed balance sheet. Of course, inflation. We should show that.